So a few months ago, I had originally written a script about why the Snyderverse fans need to let go of the DCEU. Because the DC Comics films spanning from the lukewarm Man of Steel to the mess that was Justice League have just been a narrative train wreck. And the films not directed by Zack Snyder that exist on the outskirts of the Snyderverse, more or less, have tended to do much better. But they mostly falter when they're trying so hard to remind you that Superman and Batman exist in this world. But they can't quite interact. Like, sometimes, but not always. And yet the collective of fans who are all about the Snyderverse want Zack Snyder to return to Warner Brothers so that he can deliver on Part 2 of Justice League, which was more or less promised at the end of the 2021 Zack Snyder cut of Justice League. My original script was going to be about why Warner Brothers needs to shed the Snyderverse and why Snyderverse fans need to give up on this fight that they're fighting, but I ultimately ended up shelving that script because Warner Brothers seems to have done that anyway by bringing in James Gunn to more or less reboot the DC Comics movies. But then I saw The Flash, and this film was fascinating because it best encapsulates why the Snyderverse needs to die. Not so much for the quality of the film, but the very story within The Flash, which makes a pretty good case about why we have to let go of the Snyderverse. So in order to properly explain this, I'm going to have to get into some spoilers for The Flash. So if you have not seen that film and you intend to see it at some point and don't want to have all the big twists revealed here, this is your spoiler warning. Stop here if you really want to see The Flash. The Flash movie is more or less based on the DC Comics event known as Flashpoint from 2011. The comic run told the story of Barry Allen, aka The Flash, who finds that he can use his speed powers to go back in time and save the life of his late mother, who was murdered by Dr. Thawne, aka Reverse Flash. Barry succeeds in saving his mother, but he ends up creating an alternative timeline in which so much changes. For starters, he doesn't have his speed powers, so he can't easily run back in time again and fix this all. He's got to find a way to get his powers back. Instead of Bruce Wayne surviving Crime Alley, his family of Thomas and Martha Wayne are the survivors, and Bruce is killed in the gun violence. Thomas Wayne ends up becoming Batman, and Martha Wayne ends up becoming the Joker. Superman is no longer Clark Kent, but known as Subject 1, an alien who has been under the containment of the US government ever since he crash-landed on Earth. Hal Jordan never becomes the Green Lantern, Deathstroke becomes a pirate, and Gorilla Grodd does something in Africa. I think he's conquering territories, but none of the other characters seem to bring this up or care. But the biggest change to the timeline is that now the kingdoms of Atlantis and Themyscira are at war with each other. And it's a brutal, bloody war in which there's not really going to be much of an Earth left after they're done. No hero or villain has plot armor in this story, and a lot of them die off in ways that fluctuate between being shocking and absurd. So Barry eventually does gain back his speed powers by replicating the accident that turned him into the Flash in the first place. After witnessing much death and destruction and being taunted by Reverse Flash, Barry comes to realize that the only way to save the timeline from total destruction is to go back in time and allow his mother to die. So Barry Allen ends up going back in time to stop himself from saving his mother, and the timeline is saved from the War of Atlantis and Themyscira. Well, it's kind of saved, it doesn't result in total destruction, but the whole point of Flashpoint was to ultimately lead into the big reboot that was DC's Comics The New 52, in which they basically reboot the timeline, but not really. It's kind of messy. I'll get into it more later. After rereading this comic event series after many years, I can really understand the criticisms that a lot of people had with this event series. I mean, it feels like some of the deaths are just there for shock value, and a lot of the other comics that they tacked onto the series just didn't really go anywhere. Like, there's a whole run about how Hal Jordan never gets the Green Lantern ring and he's just a pilot, and then he kind of dies in the most unceremonious way. But I have to admit that there are still parts of this comic that I really do still enjoy. The Flashpoint comics would soon be adapted into the direct-to-video animated movie Justice League: The Flashpoint Paradox. And I don't have a lot to say on the movie. It's mostly a straight adaptation of the comics, but wow, it really does push that PG-13 rating here. Like, this was before they started doing R-rated DC Comics animated movies, and it's like Reverse Flash gets a hole in his head. And just like the comics, the Flashpoint Paradox was actually a reboot for the DC Comics animated movie universe. Like, immediately after this film, most of the animated films that follow were all connected in this connected timeline. And they actually do come back and reference the Flashpoint Paradox in Suicide Squad: Hell to Pay. And this brings us to the live-action theatrical Flash movie, which does draw from the Flashpoint comic books, but not as a straight adaptation like the Flashpoint Paradox. So the movie makes some changes from the comic, which honestly, most of them on paper are kind of good, because the film actually does prune out a little bit of the crowding that happens within Flashpoint and makes it a more personal story about Barry trying to realize that he can't save his mother if he wants to preserve the timeline. So let's go through a few of the changes about how the Flash movie compares to the Flashpoint comics. The true murderer of Barry's mother is never revealed in this film because the film never introduces Reverse Flash. And we never see the killer either, so it feels like they were kind of leaving the door open here for a potential sequel in which Reverse Flash was going to be revealed. So after Barry travels back in time to save his mother, he doesn't go back to the exact point that he left, but instead stumbles out into a timeline in which he visits his 18-year-old self. It's a weird paradox, but it's a decent choice in allowing Barry to come to terms with himself and change his own mind in this particular scenario. There is no Thomas Wayne in this new timeline. It's still Bruce Wayne, except he's played by Michael Keaton, even though narratively it would make more sense for Thomas Wayne to be the Batman here, because this is supposed to take place much earlier in the timeline, and Michael Keaton is much older than Ben Affleck's Batman, so I'm not sure why they didn't just go with Thomas Wayne. Instead of Superman, who has to be freed from government containment, it's instead Supergirl, as Kal-El never made it to Earth in this timeline. The world-ending war between Atlantis and Themyscira is entirely removed from this film, and instead replaced with General Zod going back to his old terraforming ideas from Man of Steel. I want to place a name on this timeline that I feel is very appropriate for this film. Cameo Land. My reasoning for this naming will become apparent in a few moments, but I feel like this is best showcased with how Michael Keaton is reintroduced as Batman. Because this is a film that gushes hard about like the Tim Burton era of Michael Keaton's Batman. The film features Michael Keaton in his old bat suit with his old Batmobile and his old Batcave, and he says all the old lines from the original movie with awkward pauses in between, hoping that the audience will clap for catching the references.
You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts.
Oh, and shades of the original Danny Elfman Batman theme are present as well, just in case you're not fanboying enough already. The moment when the film really starts to showcase the decay of the DCEU is when it gets to the climax. So after the old Barry Allen gets his Flash powers back, the two Flashes, Batman and Supergirl, all do battle with General Zod to prevent him from destroying Earth. And they fail. Batman dies, Supergirl dies, and General Zod is able to extract the information that he needs from Supergirl's body to continue his plans of conquering Earth and building a new Krypton. So the two Barry Allens use their speed power to go back in time a few minutes in the battle to prevent the deaths of Batman and Supergirl. But they fail again. And younger Barry just keeps doing this over and over and over, but the results are always the same. They cannot undo this damage. And thankfully, the older Barry realizes that this is a fruitless attempt that is never going to preserve the timeline where their mother can come back to life. And the more that they keep going back in time, trying to place band-aids on an open wound, they end up destroying other timelines. The camera pulls out to show the flash of other timelines and how their universes are being damaged with all this time tampering. And the odd thing is that these universes are not so much represented by the Flash as they are Superman. These universes include one with George Reeves from the 1950s Superman TV series, Christopher Reeve from the Superman movies of the 1970s and 80s, and one universe has the scrapped Nicolas Cage Superman of the 1990s in which he fights a giant spider, which is a cameo that will really only make sense to people who have either heard Kevin Smith's story about trying to work on the Superman movie or have seen the documentary about the scrapped 1990s Superman film. And based on the reactions from the screening I went to, not many people knew about it. Like, they clapped for Christopher Reeve because they recognized him from the Superman movies, but when Nicolas Cage popped up, there was confusion in the audience. So knowing everything about the DCEU's failures, it's hard to look at this climax and not think about all the problems that are happening with this DC Comics movie universe. The constant need to retool the DCEU to be more of a connected universe has only damaged it further. We've seen these films try to rationalize past choices, as with Batman v Superman trying to make a case for all the destruction that happens in Man of Steel. We've seen these movies get do-overs, as with the 4-hour Zack Snyder cut of Justice League, which offered little improvement. We've seen vanity projects like Dwayne Johnson's Black Adam, which ultimately fell flat and doesn't play well with others, which led to the weird absence of the character from Shazam, Fury of the Gods. We've seen cameos that go nowhere, as with Henry Cavill showing up for a few seconds in Black Adam only for him not to return to any other DC Comics movies. We also had the nightmare sequence from Zack Snyder's Justice League, which just looks like the most awful bad Superman story. It's all just not working, and there's not enough critical praise or box office to rationalize keep going forward with this universe the same way that it is now. The bottom line and the sad truth is that the DCEU has not been a connected movie universe for many years. The dreams of transforming the DC Comics movies into a connected universe similar to the Marvel Cinematic Universe are just not happening. So at this point, you have to admit that the Snyderverse has been a failure. Because even when Barry Allen realizes that he can't save his mother, he still ends up doing damage to the timeline anyway. He comes back to his timeline to discover that he no longer has Ben Affleck as Batman and instead has George Clooney, another reference to a 1990s Batman, just in case there weren't enough cameos thrown at the wall here. And this universe, it's just still broken because it's still throwing cameos at the wall hoping that it'll tug on your nostalgic heartstrings. There's also the perfect punchline to the scene of Clooney's reveal in which Barry Allen's tooth, which came out earlier and he tried to superglue back in, just falls out. It's the perfect symbolism because you can't just keep slapping together the DCEU with crazy glue trying to fill in all the cracks because the cracks are in its foundation. You have to rebuild. So here's my biggest problem with the climax. When Barry Allen originally recalls where he was during the events of Man of Steel, we learn that he was indeed in Metropolis trying to save people during Zod's terraforming operation in which thousands of people and tons of buildings were destroyed in Metropolis. Barry is haunted by this past because he was able to save a kid from the destruction, but not his father. It's a good scene that focuses on how Barry needs to realize that he can't save everyone by tampering with time, and it parallels perfectly with his desire to preserve his parental unit. So, knowing this, it would make sense narratively for the climax to take place in Metropolis. And the film sets this up where it feels like that's where the climax is going to be. Like, we see history repeating itself, we see Zod's giant machine that's destroying Metropolis, and we see the father and son again, so you think, okay, this is going to be the moment where Barry tries to save this dad as well, and realizes that, this kid is going to grow up without a father, and that, he's going to grow up without a mother. And it's just like, it'd be a perfect moment for him to make that realization and better connect with this kid. It would be such a great moment in this film. But the film doesn't give us that moment. Because instead of the climax happening in Metropolis, it instead happens in this barren wasteland filled with absolutely nothing. There's no civilians fleeing, there's no buildings being destroyed, it's just a wide open area where only soldiers and heroes and villains will die and no other collateral damage to be had. This move reflects how the DCEU has been having this problem with environments for staging their climaxes. Man of Steel drew heavy criticism for featuring its climax in Metropolis, with the battle between Superman and Zod basically leveling the city and killing thousands of people. Batman v Superman tried to get around this by having the battle take place in the city, but also inferring that nobody was around and that it might have been evacuated. Justice League had its climax take place just outside a remote Russian village in which there weren't a lot of people in harm's way. And now we have The Flash, with its climax taking place in a deserted environment many miles away from people and buildings. But it's weird because if there were one movie where you'd want it to take place in a city in which there was a lot of destruction and a lot of people dying, it would be The Flash. This is a battle that's supposed to end on a sour note, with Barry realizing he cannot preserve this timeline. So having the setting being Metropolis, where it's being leveled to the ground and people are dying all around Barry, is thematically appropriate for this movie. And I mean, come on, it's right there. You show Metropolis, you set up the kid, the climax should take place here. And this contrasts so sharply with the Flashpoint comics, which didn't shy away from the death and destruction because it wanted to showcase just how hideous the timeline had changed. So when you're watching this climax that takes place in a vast area of a whole lot of nothing, it makes you think less about the movie and more about the choices made for this climax on an internal level. I mean, it could have been technical concerns, it could have been politically motivated by Warner Brothers trying to cover their butts, or maybe, I don't know, maybe the filmmakers really just wanted to have the climax take place in this area. But all I can think of when I look at this scene is just all the limitations of the DCEU. Because it's a cinematic universe that's become weirdly isolated. If you have a Shazam film that takes place right after Black Adam, and Black Adam can't be in that movie because of a contract dispute, and you have a Flash movie in which the only way that the Flash can interact with Superman is through these wonky CGI recreations, you no longer have a connected cinematic universe. But here's the interesting thing about The Flash, because whether it was intended to or not, it serves the same purpose as the Flashpoint comics and the Flashpoint paradox. It's meant to usher in a reboot, because currently James Gunn is working on creating his own DC Comics connected universe that is just going to start from scratch. Well, mostly. They're going to keep a few things, like, they're going to keep Viola Davis as, as Amanda Waller, because it's Viola Davis. Why would you not keep her? And that's actually an interesting point to bring up, because while the Flashpoint comics did usher in a reboot with, rebooting stuff like Action Comics with like a new Superman without the red underwear, and he wore jeans for a while, it still kept the continuity of some of the other comics, specifically like Green Lantern. Like they just kept going on even though they had to have, new numbers to usher in the new 52. And the DC Comics movies are kind of going to go down the similar route. Like, James Gunn is going to keep the stuff that worked, but, reboot the stuff that needs rebooting, which is a lot at this point. So while I didn't enjoy the Flash movie, especially since it's really hard to divorce the film from its cursed production, the external problems, and not to mention the criminal behavior of Ezra Miller, which for a lot of people, they're not going to be able to divorce themselves from that. But casting all that aside, I think the Flash film is interesting for being a bit of a herald about the future of DC Comics movies and what it needs to shed. It represents the failures of the DCEU, but also stresses to have hope for the future instead of constantly trying to go back and change the past. And that's why it's time to let the Snyderverse go. It's time for this franchise to pick itself up, dust itself off, keep the stuff that worked, and move on. And hopefully we'll get better films where superheroes can interact on a level where they're not talking about each other's mommies or appearing in weird CGI recreations.